Starting now after the church, eventually they caused so much ruckus and problems and people going on. And eventually God tells Joseph Smith that the church must leave and go to the new promised land for them. And so they leave Palmyra, New York, and go to Kirkland, Ohio. And that's their first kind of major base. And this starts a pattern over and over and over. And honestly, you kind of see this with other cults. You can't lie and misdeed and do horrible things enough until, people can't take it anymore. And so eventually at a minimum, Joseph Smith was a very charismatic person and people loved listening to him. Again, think back to God's word. It's those itching ears. Like people love listening to this guy. And so some people join and follow him and they want to believe and they want to see that he has the truth. And he's got plans and conviction and he knows where the Indians came from. It's exciting stuff, And so eventually, though, they are at a place for a time until, the house of cards comes crumbling down and then they leave. And then they get reestablished again and they do it again until the house of cards comes crashing down and then they flee again. And it just goes and goes, and it's just a downward spiral into just chaos for the next couple of decades. So if they go to Kirkland, Ohio, in Kirkland is where he gets his first word of wisdom that's published in the Doctrine and Covenants. And this is what we probably most know Mormons by, is the word of wisdom, which is what they call this Doctrine and Covenants, has to do with health and good health and what that looks like. And so from this, Mormons are not supposed to drink alcohol, have tobacco, drink what is listed as hot drinks, which what they meant by that was coffee and tea. And so some Mormons have tried to interpret, well, you can have caffeine if it's in a icy cold Pepsi Coke, which is the Mormon church has some stock in, by the way. But you can't do drugs and all that stuff. And I was actually got to spend some time in March with a Mormon missionary who is a retired guy who worked for the U.S. Agricultural Department, and he worked for Monsanto for 40 years, and he was retired, and now he's doing his Mormon mission, and he grew up in Arkansas. And so we got to talk for a long time I got to ask all sorts of Mormon questions, and he's on his mission. So it's not just young kids, but a lot of the church asks retired people, hey, use your retirement well, spend 2 years on a mission. And so we're talking, and I'm like, how do you know what's okay and what's not okay? And he's like, well, I'll tell you a secret. One time I was with my family and we were going cross country on a family vacation and it was late at night and I was so tired. And he goes, I had a Coca-Cola. Well, like caffeine, it was a big deal. And so no amphetamines, Tom, nothing like that. So anyway, it's just interesting. They have these rules. And so there are very few coffee shops compared to the rest of the United States. There are not as many, there's like one liquor store in Salt Lake proper. There are not a lot of these things, but it's everywhere. Chocolate. Sugar is a vice and it's everywhere. And there are like gourmet chocolate shops in every corner. It's really fascinating because that's caffeine you can have. So if you're a chocolate fan, you should go to Utah. So the word of wisdom is where all that comes from. Also, I heard a story, and I think it's true, but Joseph Smith would often have the meetings of leaders of the church in his living room, and almost all of them, because it's what you did. Every American smoked until 1964. It's just what you did. And so they'd be in her house, in Emma Smith's house, and they're chewing tobacco and spitting on the floor. Can you imagine 12 guys in your living room spitting tobacco juice on the floor? I'd be livid too. And they're smoking, and they're just causing all these problems. And so Emma is like, you better have a revelation from God that there's no more tobacco. And sure enough, he did. And so, but one of the theories is, well, he couldn't just nail all the husbands would go out and drink liquor and have beer and smoke, but the wives would have tea and coffee. And it's like, well, it's not fair that we get to miss out and they don't. So they're like, okay, no tea or coffee either. It's just equal punishment for everybody. So that's kind of where that comes from. That's the word of wisdom. The second thing they did that was kind of the beginning of their downfall is God gave Joseph Smith a revelation for a new building, and it was the Kirkland Temple. The Kirkland Temple was this church they were building, and it was going to be their meeting house where they had church, which is different than other temples. This was just a big church, and it was the first temple they were building. And they spent so much money and time, the Mormon community that was there, that it pretty much bankrupted the entire church. They're having huge problems. There are money issues. People are upset. But also in Kirkland, this is where Joseph Smith starts sending out the first missionaries. He feels God is calling him to send out Mormon missionaries to go proclaim others about the Book of Mormon and to get more people to join the church. And so they're going to Canada, they're going to the Americas, they're going all over to the United States to recruit people to join the church. And they build the Kirkland Temple, and it's still there today. The church eventually got so bankrupt and they caused lots of problems, and something else happened that caused them to leave. They sold the building. So the very first, most divine temple in God's plan, they actually sold because they couldn't afford to keep up, and they took the money and left town. But now I think it was recently, it was like 2015, the LDS Church bought it back finally. And so now they have the Kirkland Temple, and it's a Mormon mission. Now you can go see it, and there are Mormon missionaries hanging out, to do tours and stuff. So yeah, that was the Kirkland Temple. But the third thing is Joseph Smith, being a clever and charismatic guy, figured out a way to get out of his money troubles as he created a bank where they started printing their own money. This is one of the Kirkland Safety Society's banking notes. And the U.S. government's like, you can't just make your own money. No. And so it caused a huge rift, and there were warrants out for his arrest. And guess what? God gave him a revelation that they should leave. And so they left, and they decided to go to the God's country, Missouri, okay? They went to Jackson County, and they went to other places and established, and this is where, as you heard in the song, that God told them that the Garden of Eden was actually in Jackson County, Missouri. That's where it started. And so how great that God led them there, that's where the next place is going to be. But Norm wanted me to point out that he has his ancestry goes back to Mormons who are from Ray County, Missouri, that are there. And you can go to a Mormon cemetery and see it. And he's got his book of genealogy he'd love to show you. He's shown me many times. It's great. So they go to Missouri, and again, same thing. This time, there are more Mormons. Like, they're growing. People are joining up and being a part, and they're excited about all the things that are happening. And as they go to Missouri, they're buying up farmland. Like, they're growing, and they just, ascend on a place, and suddenly they're taking over, and people don't like it. And they're like, there's fights, and Mormons are mad at people who are drinking coffee and tea and smoking and causing them problems. And it's just tons of issues. And eventually they're like, it's just this you get us, we get you back type situation. And it just grows out of control. Literally just absolutely crazy. There's tons of persecution. Newspapers are writing about it. And to the Mormons, they're saying, you just hate the truth. Joseph Smith is a prophet of God, and you're just persecuting us. We're victims. Not talking about the Mormons who are fighting back, but they're just taken as people who are fighting. Now, what does Jesus say we should do for our enemies? We should love them. We should pray for them, right? And we should be really careful and wise in how we deal with people who are spreading false prophets and truths. Especially, I could meet a Mormon missionary, that's just fine. But if a Mormon missionary were to suddenly spend all their time with my kid in the park and I didn't know about it, I'd be pretty frustrated, right? So people have a genuine concern for what's happening in their cities. It's really frustrating, but people just take it out of control. And it's just going nuts. It's going all the way up to the state government. The legislature is passing rules against Mormons. They can't have that. So this is the craziest thing in the world. Governor Libbern Boggs starts approving legislation that's inhibiting Mormons. It's unconstitutional. Mormons can buy land if they want. They're saying all these rules against them, and it's kind of going nuts. And so Joseph Smith has this guy, and just look at this picture. You just know that guy's trouble, right? Okay. Porter Rockwell is like an American Wild West legend. You can read all sorts of crazy stories about this guy, but he was Joseph Smith's bodyguard trigger man dude. Okay. And so Porter Rockwell, we don't have DNA evidence or fingerprints, but basically he was gone for 24 hours. And during that 24 hours, someone tried to assassinate the governor. And he was in his living room, and someone took a shotgun and shot right through the window, through the glass, and hit the governor in the neck. And he recovered, but he got hit with a couple different bullets from the shotgun blast. And he knew it was Mormons. So he literally declares open war against Mormons. And Mormons their homes are burned down. It's really horrible. The Mormon-Missouri War is a real deal. Now, there weren't thousands of people who were murdered or something. It was still a horrible situation. And so eventually they decide to leave. So they decide to go back from Missouri over across the river to Nauvoo, Illinois. And they have safety in Nauvoo. And they even had approval from the state legislature where there was a young up-and-coming politician named Abraham Lincoln, who was there, who said, yeah, you guys can live here, just don't cause troubles. They didn't really hear, they couldn't look up on Twitter and hashtag Mormon War in Missouri. Like they just, they didn't know. And so they're having this war, and Nauvoo grows. In fact, one historian said that at one time its population was larger than Chicago. So Nauvoo, Illinois grows to a huge Mormon metropolis. They start building a new temple. And in Nauvoo, a lot of interesting things happen, and it's kind of the darkest turn of the church. The first thing is Joseph Smith finds something he'd never seen before, and that is a cool secret society, he thought, called the Masonic Lodge. And so he found the Freemasons and decided to join and became a big fan of the Freemasons. And it's 1 month after he officially got his Scottish rights as a Freemason. I don't even know what that means. But when he became an official Freemason guy, 1 month later, he said God has given him another revelation of new ceremonies that need to happen in the Mormon temple. And the first kind of placeholder temple until their place was done was the Masonic Hall. And so the very first Mormon temple rites that were happening were in the Masonic Hall, and so with the Freemasons. And so there are Freemasons who have become Mormons, and they're like, "Wait a minute, I've done all this before." Like he literally plagiarized again. Freemasons wear aprons when they do it. I've heard stories of, I think I had an ancestor, a great-great-grandfather, that said, I want to be buried in my Mason apron. I don't know what that means, but they had aprons, and when you're inducted into the temple, you're given an apron. And they wear certain hats, and in the temple, they wear certain hats. And so, it's just totally a plagiarism of all those Masonic temples and stuff. And then also, probably something you've heard about, this is where the magic Mormon underwear comes from, if you've ever heard of that. Basically, men and women, once they go through the temple ceremonies, are given undergarments, and they're told to wear them at all times. And on the men and women, there's a compass, okay? There's the compass, and a square, which are the Freemason symbols that are on, you can go downtown to Salt Lake and buy them today. And they're there. And Mormons who are temple, certified will wear those all the time. So yeah, all sorts of cool stories. Joseph Smith starts sending out more and more missionaries. In fact, I met a guy who was a Mormon his whole life, part of the LDS Church, and he said his grandfather in the 1800s lived in Germany. And the reason they're there, they immigrated to the United States because Mormon missionaries went to Germany and they heard and joined the church and migrated to America to be a part of God's new favorite religion. And so Mormon missionaries are going all over the United States. They're going to Native American tribes. They're going to all around the world to proclaim this. And this is where, at the same time, the idea of what is Doctrine and Covenants 132, which is the understanding of plural marriage. The revelation given through Joseph Smith the prophet in Nauvoo on July 13th, 1843. And this is a revelation. And in it, he says, there were 3 times that God told me I need to do this, but I told him, no, I don't want to. But eventually God said, no, you have to do it. And so he gave in. And the idea of plural marriage is what we would call polygamy. A man can have multiple wives. But officially, the way it's into the doctrine of the church is that as you go through all of these things, you're going up the ladder of being a good Mormon. You're paying your tithes, you're being a part of the church, you're serving, you're proving yourself worthy. And then the big level, like when you are made it, is being able to be approved into the temple. And to get in there, you have to have an interview with a bishop. You've got to do all this stuff. They look at your last 10 years of giving records to make sure you've tithed 10% to the church. They're looking at all these things. And then if you get entry into the temple, well, now you can be part of the priesthood and be indoctrinated in the temple. And the ultimate, there's, I can't remember if it's 3 or 5 different temple endowments, temple ceremonies you go through in order to make your way to the top. And the top tier one is your marriage, being sealed in the temple, having this eternal marriage. And if you go through that, you go through all the steps, you get to be in the top tier of heaven. Yes, Mormons believe there are multiple tiers of heaven. And we'll talk about that next week, all the differences and who goes where. But to get in the very top tier, you have to have been sealed in an eternal marriage. And in Doctrine and Covenants 132, which, by the way, has been repealed, but it's still in the book, is that to get there, you have to have plural marriage. So initially when it's first taught, you have to have multiple wives in order to get there. And so that's the whole plan and purpose. And then in the afterlife, you will get the chance to become your own gods. And the more wives you have, the more families you have, the more worlds you get to be a god over. And so that's at the end of the line of Mormonism. And so plural marriage becomes a big deal. And so Joseph Smith starts marrying himself to other people, and he also practices polyamory. So this disgusting chart shows all the different wives of Joseph Smith. And it shows their ages. There were 7 of them under the age of 18. His first plural wife was 14. And you look at them, and what's really crazy to me, some of them had, the blue ones here, had living husbands. So Joseph Smith would tell different men, hey, God's told me. He told you guys are going to go be prophets of God. And he wants you to go to Canada and go reach the people there. There's people he wants you to save. And while they're gone, he would have a secret marriage ceremony with their wives while they're gone. And then he would say, we're sealed forever in eternity, but then he would annul the earthly marriage before the missionary came back. And so this secret went on for a couple of years before it got out there. And I don't know about you, but that would not make me very happy. And so some guys started creating a newspaper. And so Joseph Smith, also sick of all these governments and people trying to attack the Mormons, says, we're not going to do it anymore. God has given me now authority to be a general. And he became lieutenant general of the Nauvoo militia. And he declared himself a general. And now he's got troops, and they bought guns and they trained them. And now he's in charge because he doesn't want people to attack him. And then after that, he decided, I think it'd be best if I ran for president of the United States. And that's when the legislature of Illinois is like, we don't like what's going on. This is not a good thing. And so these guys in Nauvoo, started by guys who Joseph Smith manipulated them as missionaries and took advantage of their wives. They published a newspaper called the Nauvoo Expositor. And the whole purpose of this Nauvoo newspaper was to let out, it's like the WikiLeaks of the 1800s. They're going to expose all the secrets of the church. And so Joseph Smith hears about it and gets his militia, and they burn down the newspaper stand. Well, that makes news all over Illinois that we have freedom of press. You can't just burn down a newspaper publisher because you don't like what they're saying. So literally, the government sends a militia, and they send the county sheriff and a bunch of people, and they arrest Joseph Smith. And then what happens next is what Mormons will tell you on June 27th was the martyrdom of Joseph Smith. And for generations, they told that his defenseless self, locked in his cell, eventually a mob came and they broke down the jail and they killed him and his brother and destroyed him. And he was a martyr for his faith. He was persecuted for his religion. But when you look at actual government documents, investigators, court cases, and things that happened, interviews with eyewitness testimony, all these other people are explaining what actually happened. And while Joseph Smith was in jail, this is what they want you to believe. He was a martyr. They'll tell you today he was a martyr for his faith. He was killed for what he believed. Technically, that's true. He believed he was doing what he wanted to do. So this mob comes, attacks, and they burn down the thing. Well, the day before, what happened is that Joseph Smith's family visited him in jail, and just like the old trope out of the movies, like putting in a metal file inside a sandwich, like they smuggle in all sorts of things into the jail, including some pistols, a pepper box shotgun pistol, and a bunch of stuff, and things to try to break out. And eventually, the mob hears about the newspaper. They hear what happened, and they're like, "We're done. He's sleeping with our wives," all this stuff, and they go to raid the jail. And there's a shootout. And Joseph Smith and his brothers died in a fight. They're fighting over the door. They're shooting through the door. It wasn't like some innocent persecution. And so this is the most recent painting of the event. It's in the Salt Lake Museum downtown about the life of Joseph Smith. And here he is. He's worried, right? See the painting? And what's really fascinating, here's the scary mob painting on their faces, going to attack. It's a great painting. But when you actually look, there are guns in their pockets. because they can't not say they had guns, because we have evidence that they had guns, but they just paint, they're not using them, right? It's like, how far are you going to take this, guys? So it's pretty crazy. But he was died. Nauvoo, Illinois is a major Mormon place. That's his death mask. That seems really weird to us, but historically, this is what you did. Not everyone had their photo taken in their life. And so a lot of times they'd get a plaster mold of someone who passed away to have a picture of their face to remember what they would look like. We have the death mask of Abraham Lincoln. There's a lot of things. It was normal at the time to do that. And so we have Joseph Smith's death mask of after he passed away. And so it's pretty fascinating. Well, after that, there's a great struggle. This one true church was now fractured, and there are actually 4 different people who claim that Joseph Smith told him that he was going to be the next leader of the church. And so they're all vying for several years of who's going to be the next leader. And Brigham Young kind of won the game because he got Emma Smith to be his ally. She joined him and said, no, God told Joseph that Brigham Young is supposed to be the new prophet of the church. And so in 1847, Brigham Young says, hey, there's no place for us. Lord knows we're not going back to Missouri. The promised land is where no one's been before, and that's where we're going to go. And so they went out in trails out west, and many of them went without horses and oxen. And it's around 5,000 Mormon pioneers went out west, and many of them died along the trail. And most of them carried their wagons, post wagons themselves. These are tough people. The first winter, several hundred of them died from malnourishment and yellow typhoid and all sorts of diseases that were in their camp and stuff. And eventually, they make it over the hill to Salt Lake. And when they came over the crest in this valley and they looked down and they saw the Salt Lake, they're like, this is it. This is the promised land. God told Brigham Young this is the place. They didn't know at the time that the lake was full of salt water. They thought it was normal water. But that was the issue. But they spend their time out in Salt Lake in Utah, and that became the new place where they lived. And so there were a lot of different crazy things that happened throughout there. There's still some Mormons left at this time in Missouri, in Illinois, and even in upstate New York and Ohio. But most of them all migrate out west. And they said, this is the new promised land God has given us. And they actually formed at first a new country called Deseret. Basically, they went in what was at the time Mexico, because Mexico had that property up until we took it from them in the Mexican War, and Pancho Villa and all that. And so this region became known as Deseret, this great basin in the southwest. And when Mexico fell, the Mormons were like, oh, great, this is our new country. And it was called Deseret. And so you'll see a lot of the Deseret News is their local Salt Lake paper. There's a lot of stuff like that. You'll hear that because that was their thing for a long time. And that became their place. And so, for all their horrible things, they're Mormons, but they're Americans and they're pioneers. And they went through this place and they brought civilization in the middle of nothing. And they built homes and schools and all sorts of amazing things. Eventually, the railroad comes through. They do lots of great things, and eventually, they pass all the muster for everything that's required in the U.S. Constitution to have 50,000 people to agree and all this stuff to become a territory and then to become a state. But the U.S. Government, our Congress says, you're not going to become a state unless you outlaw polygamy, because that's not okay. And so who would have thunk it, but the prophet of God of the Mormon church had a revelation that polygamy is not allowed anymore. And so they forbid it. You can't have it anymore. But it's coming back. It's in style in Utah today. And so many of the Mormon families who said, no, this is a word from Joseph Smith the prophet. You can't just say no. And so many of them shattered. And today, which I find fascinating, the one true restored church of the Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints actually has 20 different splits and denominations, all claiming that they're the one true church with the one true prophet. And most of them that have split off are all polygamous cults. Many of them, during the statehood of Utah, which is named after the Ute Indians, they went south to Mexico, where it was still okay to be a polygamist. And there are large Mormon communities in Mexico today. And, they speak Spanish and they're farmers and they're, white, just like all the other Mormons. And so it's really fascinating. And recently, there's been a lot of news over the last 5-10 years because the cartels are trying to own them and get a piece and stuff. And the Mormons are like, And they're like literally going to war with the cartels in Mexico. It's really fascinating. Anyway, Salt Lake becomes a new state, and Mormonism becomes a new leader. And what's really fascinating is based on our Constitution and the compromises we made in our government, we have 2 houses of our legislature. Parliament in England has 1 parliament. Well, they have the House of Lords, which you got to be born into, and then you have the House of Commons. But in America, we have the Senate and the House of Representatives, right? Every state in the union has that, except for Utah. They have 1 body and has the same numbers as leaders in the Mormon Church. Isn't that funny? It's the exact same layout, which is pretty interesting. So anyway, that's the Mormonism and history there. Eventually, during this time, there's several different prophets. They established the church. They built, and that's what's in the background that's been back here the whole time, is the Salt Lake Temple, which is really a gorgeous building. It's really cool. And the secret, the fascinating thing about Mormonism and temples is like they're gorgeous, beautiful buildings, but like only the top tier Mormons who go through this progress are allowed to go and be a part of those temples. And like no, you can't just walk in. There's security guards, and they actually have a global registry of people around the planet who are allowed to go in and be a part of there. And so you've got to pay your dues, literally, if you're going to become and be a part of what the church is. During that time, there's been several different prophets. There's a lot of wars. There's a Mormon-Utah war that happened after the Civil War. The U.S. government says, no, we signed a treaty, we bought this land, we own this, you can have a territory, but you don't have the authority over this. And there was a lot of fights and scuffles that happened. And in fact, I watched a really interesting documentary the other day about the layout of the streets of Salt Lake City and how, the temple is here. And so they put the Capitol building and the federal government building on the hill above it, just to show them you're not in charge. And there's a lot of fights and stuff that happen with that. And I would say today, though, that's not the case. Mormons are known as like the best Americans. They pay their taxes, they work hard, they have great kids, they're the best employers. In fact, when the FBI was looking to have a Western base out in the Midwest or in the West, Southwest, because they had, in Washington, D.C., they had their FBI headquarters. They were looking for a West Coast base. They did an extensive study on where they should go, what it looks like. And when they looked at the places that had the lowest corruption, the hardest working people, the lowest amount of alcoholism, they don't want FBI agents showing up drunk and stuff. Salt Lake was it. Utah was the place because Mormons are clean-cut, good-looking people who work really hard because their salvation is based on what they do. And that's, I think, the greatest reason of why Mormonism is the opposite of Christianity. Christianity is different than every other world religion. As missions pastor and at New Heights, we talk about a lot of different world religions. I have interns and we have equipped classes. And I think every religion starts from the same place, and that is something's wrong. You don't have to be on this earth very long to realize, I don't think this is okay. There are wars, there are people killing each other. Like, this isn't, everyone in their bones says this is not how it's supposed to be. But what's wrong and why it's wrong and what do we do to fix it is where every religion is different. And what's different from Christianity and every other world religion is it says, this is a God-sized problem and you can't fix it. That's what's so beautiful about the gospel, is there's nothing you can do. Because when it comes to the perfective, infinite righteousness of God, you can't even come close. And so God did that for you. And so the difference between Christianity and Mormonism, and next week, we'll get into theology and belief and structure and a lot of stuff, and then how to reach your Mormon friend, how to relate to them, how to talk to them, minister to them. To get there, Mormons, like the biggest challenges and differences is Mormons believe that Jesus did just enough. Jesus basically, like you were in debt and Jesus wiped out your debt. But are you a millionaire? Not yet. Now you've got to do righteous deeds in order to earn your righteousness to be like God. That's not what the gospel says. The New Testament says Christ's righteousness is now on your account. If you are in Christ, God doesn't look at the earth and see good people and bad people. He looks at the earth and he sees people who are sinful and deserve judgment, and he sees Jesus. Because if you're in Christ, if you believe and repent and trust and follow him, God looks at you and he doesn't see you really trying. He sees Jesus. He sees Christ's infinite holiness, fully paying the law on your account. And that's what's so beautiful about the gospel. And that's what makes Mormonism such a perversion of the gospel. And so, that's kind of all I have for tonight. And we got time for questions. So it's 8:13, so I did pretty good. But any questions, concerns? It can be about anything Mormonism. If it's not about Mormonism, I will not ask. Yeah.
Well, sir, do you know anything about the
Yeah. And
because they originated from Arkansas.
yeah, one of the doctrines, Brigham Young taught a lot of crazy things. And one of his statements is that there was a race of people that lived on the moon. Most of the most racist things about Mormonism come from Brigham Young. I don't think, it's not like Joseph Smith was a civil rights leader or something, but like he wasn't horrible, but he wasn't great. Brigham Young was like, has a prophetic statement that African Americans have black skin because they're cursed by God and they cannot be a part of the priesthood of the church. And so just very racist, very horrible stuff. Another thing that he taught that was horrible is what it called blood debt. And that if someone murdered one of your people, they owed you in their blood, and you need to go get that blood by murdering them back, like this horrible, repercussions. And so there's a pretty famous story if you look it up. It's not on Mormon front pages, but it was famous for Arkansas that in the 1850s, 1860s, somewhere around there. I'm not exactly sure on the date, but 15 families, over 150 Arkansans from Harrison, Arkansas, wanted to migrate to California. And so they went out the wagon trails out west, and they went through Salt Lake and got supplies and food to get through the Rocky Mountains. And then they were going to go south to California. And they, from all recorded evidence, it sounds like they were not treated great. They bought some supplies from the Mormons in Salt Lake. Salt Lake had been around about 20 years. So it's not like it's a city today. Like it was like they weren't living in tents, but they're making their way. So anyway, these Arkansan families got food and supplies and stuff, and they made their way south. And about a day later, Brigham Young's kind of head militia guy named John D. Lee attacks that Arkansan family's wagon train, and with a militia made up of Mormons and Ute Indians that they had come with them, and they killed over 150 adults. They murdered all the families, but they didn't kill the children, and they took them home to Salt Lake, and they put all the kids in Mormon families. And eventually, word gets out from somebody that this happened. And it took about 10 years for the U.S. government, in the midst of the Civil War, to actually send a cavalry battalion to Salt Lake, find all these kids, and bring them back to Arkansas. So because of that, Arkansans have not had a good relationship with Mormons. And in fact, if you look at Mormons, a map of where Mormons are in the United States, there's never been a presence in Arkansas for one of these very reasons. And that's why putting a Mormon temple here is such a fascinating change of history and dynamics of people, because the question is, I even asked some Mormons, like, why here, why now? Why would you do this? And they said it's really simple. They're former Mormons. They said it's really easy. To be a part of the temple ceremonies, to get that, you have to have paid all of your tithes, and you have to be serving and be a part of the church. But if the closest temple is in Kansas City, 3.5 hours away, it's not like you're going to work really hard to try to make sure you're up to scratch and everything you're supposed to be. Because, when you realize your kid's turning 16 and you should probably go to the temple, then maybe you'll start paying your dues. Does this make sense? And so what happens is, historically, Arkansans have not been down with Mormonism, but I don't know the exact figures, but it's estimated like 60% of Northwest Arkansas is not from Arkansas, right? So many people are coming here for Walmart and Tyson and J.B. Hunt's and all the vendors and all the people. And so people are moving here. And lots of Mormons are moving here. And there's no temple. And so they're not paying their money. And so if they put a temple here, well, now they all have to pay. And so it's just a money situation. Yeah, it's multi-million dollars to put in this really beautiful temple, but you'll make your money back when everyone starts tithing to do all of their rituals. Next week, we'll talk about what they do in the temple and what that looks like and all that stuff. But what's fascinating about the Mountain Meadows Massacre, and the reason I talked about Brigham Young talking about blood debt and talking about that, is I found out literally in March by talking to my elder Bone, the missionary guy, B-O-H-N, Elder Bone. He was the guy who was on his Mormon mission as a retiree. And we were talking about Arkansas. We're talking about Arkansas and Mormons because he grew up in Arkansas in the 60s. And he goes, did you know that one of the 12 apostles of the Mormon church was murdered in Alma, Arkansas? And I was like, I did not know that. And as someone who loves history, I'm glad you told me. And so he told me the whole story. And this guy whose name was, I think it began with a P because his name alliterated. It was like Princeton or Principal or something like that. His last name was Pratt. So it was like Princeton Pratt. And he was one of the 12 apostles under the Mormon church, which is the people who are directly underneath Joseph Smith. And he was sent by Joseph Smith as a missionary from Missouri to Arkansas back in the day. And so he goes down to Arkansas. No, I'm sorry. It was later because Brigham Young sent him to Missouri and Oklahoma and Arkansas. And so he goes through on his mission. And there's a man from Arkansas. I don't remember the guy's name. He's the guy who murdered him. He and his wife were having fights because he was an alcoholic. Wasn't a great husband. His wife runs off on him. And so he's tracking down his wife. She goes to Oklahoma. She goes to Kansas. He's trying to find his wife. She hears Princeton Pratt preaching on the square. That's hard to say. Princeton Pratt preaching on the square. And she's like enthralled. This guy's awesome. And Princeton Pratt convinces her to be his 12th wife. And so she joins him while he's on his mission. And eventually they're like, well, let's go to Arkansas. And Arkansan alcoholic guy finds out they're going to Alma, Arkansas. So he beats him there. And he tries to get the county sheriff. Look, this guy abducted my wife. I need your help. And he's like, man, we'll talk to him when they get here, but we're not just going to arrest them. Like there's a process here, right? We're going to do justice. And so he comes into Alma, Arkansas and starts preaching on the square. And Arkansan alcoholic guy just walks up and just boom. Just murders him in the street. And so here's what's crazy. 3 months later, the Mountain Meadow Massacre happened in Utah. So it's really clear to see, there was an exact debt that was being paid because of we murdered one of their prophets, so they're going to murder all the Arkansans. And so it just had this long history of Arkansas not doing well with the Church of Mormon. So anyway, that's probably not the best for a church equip class, but it's a crazy story, and it's true. So anyway, you can look it all up and find out all about it. But anyway, other questions that don't have to do with murder or mayhem?
What is
Yeah, no, you're good.
they do a reenactment. What's that?
What is the reenactment? Yeah, Mormons do a passion play on a couple different ways. One, in the Hill Cumorah in upstate Utah. It's a big Mormon pilgrimage site, and in the summers they do big festivals. I mean, thousands of people, and Mormons love the arts, okay, and they love sports. Their kids are in the best of activities, and so there's tons of Mormon dramas and choirs and lots of artistic outlets there. And so there are tons of young people who are part of this Mormon play in upstate New York, where they reenact the whole story of the Book of Mormon. Yeah, Mormon, Nephi, the fights, like it's a big, huge, dramatic play, really beautiful thing. And the art department and the what do you call that? Theater department. And Brigham University was huge. They put a ton of money into it. And universities in Utah spend a lot of time and money developing these things so that they can promote more and better publications and videos. And if you look, I mean, their video production and quality is awesome. Acting, pretty good, not great. But there's lots of really good stuff that they produce. They put a lot of stuff. And there are different places around the country where they'll have plays and things like that. Yeah.
There's something that they reenact, like they dress up as Pilgrim.
Yeah. Oh, okay. So one of the things they do, there's Pioneer Days that they have in Kansas and in Utah and other towns like where the trails are, and different towns will commemorate that. And Mormons will have Pioneer Day. I had a friend who grew up in Utah, and on Pioneer Day, school was let out. It was like the 4th of July, and they have parades and they drive covered wagons in to remember their ancestors that literally cut their way into the wilderness. And so just commemorating that. But yeah, there's too many Mormon productions to try to get them all straight. Yeah.
Going back to like the Bible and like how they're properly translating it.
Yeah.
Is there any passages that in your conversations that you run into that they like pretty consistently like argue against or have rebuttal?
Their number one thing is where it all goes. And I actually saw a Mormon missionary show me her book called it's called Preach My Word, and it's the handbook that Mormon missionaries are trained in. And it says when someone comes to you and gives you a question like, what about gay marriage in America? What about abortion? What about, and they bring up any hot button issue, it all comes down to one thing. This is in the book. They're telling them, is the Book of Mormon true? That's what you need to ask them. And James, if you ask in faith, God will give you an answer, is the most used verse. Because Mormons will tell you and teach, how do I know the Book of Mormon is true? I prayed and I felt it. And I just knew it's real. Like I've heard, I don't even know how many dozen Mormon missionaries in person say that to me. I know it's true because God's word says in James, I think it's 1:5, if you pray, God will give you an answer. And so I prayed earnestly, God, is this true? And man, I just felt it. I just knew it was true. God told me it was true. They call it a burning in the bosom. That's their word of like this conviction you have of God telling you it's true. And so they will do that all the time. And the reason why I spent so much time talking about anachronisms and plagiarism and all this stuff is because that's a very good point. If the Book of Mormon is true, then what is being said is probably pretty important. But the problem is we can clearly show. It's like, it doesn't have to be just an emotion. Like, I think we serve an emotional God. I think God created emotions in us for good things. And I think God is a passionate God. But that doesn't mean it has to be absent from logic and argument and being wise. And so they're trying to just cut that in half. And I have a quote, well, maybe I'll show it next week, but it just shows Mormons don't want to know, those who are in it. And there are many of them who are taught lies and misled, but when they finally get the truth, they realize, I can't believe this. And so that's why next week is so important, because I'll say this fact. Are we done? I got a few more minutes, but I was with a man, I'll share more information about him last year. He's in Utah and he has a ministry in different universities, and we got to spend some time with him. And he said that 80% of Mormons who leave the church become completely agnostic, because all that outreach and ministries and people have done has just torn down their beliefs in religion. And so when they finally get to a breaking point, they think it's all a joke, it's all a sham. And so then they find the answer, and many of them have freedom because they're leaving legalism. And they're like, oh, I can be free. I can literally, Mormons are like taking selfies that this is my first cup of coffee. And they're just, so excited. And but it leads them down this life of just self-indulgence and just living in their flesh. And they realize, man, this isn't the way either. And so that's why the way we reach Mormons is so important, because if we can make fun of the Book of Mormon and Joseph Smith all day long. But one, that's not going to gain us points with them. And two, we need to get them to be answering, what is truth? Not, you believe a lie. And so it's like, if there is a prophet of God, how do we know he is true? What does God's word say about that? How do we do that? So we'll talk about a lot more techniques and things next week. But other questions? Yeah.
Can you explain the difference between a temple and a church?
Yeah, so Mormons will have meeting houses and churches, sometimes called a steakhouse, not a steakhouse. But these Mormon wards, they've literally taken every county in the United States and broken them up in sections, and they have designated wards. You don't get a choice, like as Protestant evangelicals. It's kind of sad, but when we go to a new town, we do what we're accused of being church shopping. And we're going around to find one we like, and hopefully we have some sort of theological rigor to help us figure out why we're choosing that, and not just who has the best coffee. But you do not get that in the Book of Mormon. Wherever your ward is, you go to that ward church, and they're going to keep attendance, and that's how that works. Now, the Mormon, sometimes they call it a meeting house or the ward. Anyone can go. They have church every Sunday. You can walk in and listen. They'll greet you and be really nice if you're there. By the way, when you go to any place of worship of any religion, you shouldn't really be that nervous because, put yourself in their shoes. When a guest comes into New Heights, how do you treat them? Hey, is this your first time? Where are you from? Did you get some coffee? Let me help you check in your kids. That's how everyone is. You want to be welcoming, right? I've never been to a Hindu temple, a Buddhist temple, a mosque when people don't literally come up and give me a hug. We're so glad you're here. It's like, okay, they're humans too. People like to be welcomed. So you can go to a Mormon meeting house and you can go on a Sunday and someone will give a testimony. They'll sing songs. And one thing that's really interesting is they all do the same lesson Bible story worldwide. And so that's kind of cool. If your kid went to church when he's away at college because you know what the Bible story was this week. And if he doesn't tell you what it is, so it's pretty interesting. But the temple are very few and far between. For the longest time, the Salt Lake Temple was the only temple. That's a big reason why all the Mormons were going to Salt Lake. But temples are being more and more brought around the United States and around the world. There are thousands and thousands of meeting houses. There are maybe a couple hundred tops temples. They're building more around the United States because they'll get a ton of funds and support from that. But very few people can go into a temple. You've got to be approved to do that. And one of the cool things that, as you guys can tell what a nerd I am, last summer we were able to go to the temple because before they open a new temple, they let anyone come in. It's an open house. And they let us go with our Gentile germs to just go through and observe. And they'll show you everything. They'll open the janitor's closet. They're showing you, we're not weird, creepy people. And they'll tell you, the things that happen in here are not secret. They're just sacred. And so, it's just these private religious ceremonies that you can't go because you're not approved. But we literally had to wear surgery smocks on our feet and as we walked in and stuff. It's pretty fascinating. So that's on my literally is on my bucket list. And I got to go last summer inside a Mormon temple. So anyway, Mormon temples have many of the same rooms. They'll have a baptistry for the dead. We'll talk about that next week. They're not baptizing dead people, don't worry. They have rooms where you receive the Holy Spirit, basically confirmation, they believe. They have sealing rooms, wedding rooms, and then they'll all have a room called the Celestial Room, which is probably the most beautiful room you've ever been in your life. And it's just crystal chandeliers and everything is white, everything's white. It's something out of a movie set or something. And it's supposed to be the place where you can meet with God and experience what heaven's going to be like in the future or something like that. So Mormon temples are all that way and they have really good security.
My son married into this with his extended family, and they have the family values, the family, everything out, and plus the community that surround them.
Mm-hmm.
Is that based on the word of wisdom and working your way toward salvation, or is that more of an emphasis in their scripture?
It's both. We'll really get into this next week, but Heavenly Father's plan for all of us is to have multiple, to have large, wonderful Mormon families. And they believe children are a blessing from God and we should have as many of them as possible, which, to be honest, God's word, the Bible, does say a lot about having many children and how they're a blessing from the Lord and blesses the man whose quiver is full of them and kids are a blessing. And American Christians don't always live by that. But Mormons take it really, really seriously. And it's a big part of having it. Now, part of that is, if you're trying to create your own little holy civilization, the more people you have, the stronger you are. And Mormons were constantly kicked like dogs throughout America because they weren't stronger and bigger than other people. And so, I think that's a factor as well. And also by having multiple wives. In fact, I've had Mormon missionaries tell me the reason God allowed polygamy was because so many Mormons died, especially the men going out west. Well, when you actually look at the numbers, that's not true. It's a great argument. Literally, here's let's say there's hundreds of Mormon families that all their husbands died. They probably need a man to help out around the house, blah, blah, blah. But that's not what happened. It doesn't line up on the timeline, doesn't line up with the numbers. Lots of Mormons died, but it wasn't all the men. So anyway, that's what they'll tell you. Family values are huge. And so if you're just the average American And you're looking around, and then here's this church, this LDS church, all the kids get good grades, they're the best sports players, they don't drink, you're not going to be worried if they're having, it just makes sense. And it's because not only does the church enforce this, and we'll talk about next week how it happens and what that looks like and the anthropology of it and what makes a cult and how do they do that. But it's good stuff, but it's just completely without the gospel. And so, yeah, lots of challenges. And we'll explain a lot more of that stuff next week. Any other questions? You guys were great to sit here and listen to me talk for so long. Thanks for everything. If you have any other questions, you can let me know. We will be here last week. Like we said, we are recording it. And so if you have someone who really wants to hear me blather for 2 hours about Mormon history, you can show that with them. But we'll have a lot more next week, and you can see all this later. So thanks so much. Thanks to New Heights for making it all happen. And God bless you. Thank you.